Danger, danger, gun owners in New Jersey. The state of New Jersey, in their attempt to get around NYSERPA versus Bruin, is actually trying to say that anyone on the so-called FBI terrorist watch list is not allowed to have a gun in New Jersey, cannot buy a gun, and presumably cannot carry a gun under the new proposal. The problem is, of course, that no one has any idea what's on the terrorist watch list except the federal government controlled by Joe Biden. This seems to be problematic on a lot of levels, including the fact that it probably violates NYSERPA versus Bruin and the Second Amendment. Stay tuned. I'm going to break this down. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and best-selling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so and show your love for the right to keep and bear arms. In New Jersey, folks, even if you don't live in New Jersey, you need to pay attention, because what the people in New York and New Jersey are trying to do, in California trying to do in their states, the anti-gun politicians at least, they want to bring to all of us all across America. That's why it's very important that all Americans know exactly what's going on in these anti-gun states, because that is really the experiment. That is the testing pot, if you will, of the anti-gun movement. They want to see how things work in California, in New Jersey, in New York, and then they want to bring it to a home near you in your state. Okay, what's going on in New Jersey? Now, I've talked a lot about this crazy proposed law in New Jersey involving the new standards for who's allowed to carry guns outside the home. Now that New Jersey got spanked in NYSERPA versus Bruin, and based on NYSERPA versus Bruin, New Jersey's trying to create a new criteria as to who should be able to carry guns. Again, before NYSERPA versus Bruin, New Jersey was trying to discriminate against gun owners, trying to exercise subjective discretion as to who needed a gun, who was special to have a gun. Now they're trying to exercise subjective discretion that they're working on as to who is good enough to have a gun, arguing that they get to assess, do you have the temperament and are you got good moral character before you're allowed to have a gun? And they get to exercise their subjective discretion as government agents to determine, are you good enough? And as part of that, I noticed in this proposed law, they say that anyone who is on the consolidated terrorist watch list maintained by the Terrorist Screening Center administered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, this is on page 8, by the way, of the proposed legislation, is not allowed to acquire a gun and presumably cannot carry a gun. Now, I don't like terrorists any more than you don't like terrorists, right? We cheered against the terrorists on 9/11, and that would be fine if you had legitimate and actual bad dude terrorists, but that's, in my opinion, not really what this is getting at. Because the reality is, the harsh reality of this is this, and I wrote about this in my book called First They Came for the Gun Owners, which I published, in 2019. I laid out in extreme detail the entire battle plan of the anti-gun movement in America. And one part of that, of course, was to label all people that support the Second Amendment, that support gun rights, that support back then Donald Trump and Republican policies, etc., etc. They would be labeled domestic terrorists by the anti-gun foes, by the anti-gun movement in America that controlled the government. And apparently, I'm guessing that I could see that happening with the federal government under Joe Biden. Because I want to remind all of us, as you in New Jersey look at this proposal, this is actually proposed in statute right now, but I want you to talk about what I saw not that long ago in an article, a major article by some prominent journalists in the Washington Times. This is the headline of the article. Joe Biden is accused of pressuring the FBI to fabricate extremist and white supremacist cases. Basically, according to the article, it says rank and file FBI agents are accusing the Biden administration of exaggerating the threat of white supremacists and pressuring agents to cook up domestic terrorist cases involving racist extremists. Now, this is only from September 15th of 2022. This is just a little bit more than a month ago, right? So it's just recently. So I'm not surprised at all, because in my opinion, and this is not the way it always was in America, but this is the way it is today. I think a lot of people that think that if you support the Second Amendment, if you support the right to keep and bear arms, if you support Donald Trump, if you support Ron DeSantis, if you support smaller government and lower taxes, if you support closing the border and the only people allowed into the country are those that we get permission to come into the country, well, it seems to me there's a lot of people out there that label people like that deplorables. They label them clinging to their guns and to their religion. All these things that are negative and racist and extremist, all this absurdity, these ad hominem attacks. Nevertheless, there are people apparently among the left in America that believe a lot of the stuff is true, that people that support the Second Amendment are somehow evil people when really we're civil rights activists as I see it. But nevertheless, the point is that if New Jersey passes the law that allows anyone that's put on the FBI watch list, well, trust me, there is no adjudication. There's no objectivity there. There's none of the standards that are met under NYSERPA versus Bruin, because I looked up the FBI Terrorist Screening Center criteria, and this is very interesting. I'd never done this before. So just as a reminder, after 9/11's attacks, the FBI created this terrorist screening center to try to do extra scrutiny, prevent people from getting on the planes and all that. Now, this is what's interesting. This is from and I'll link this to this is from the FBI's own website. It says that most of the people on the terrorist watch list are not Americans. Well, if most of the people on the terrorist watch list are not Americans, that means that some Americans are on this watch list, okay? Don't know who they are? Be very interested. But here's the other thing that I found that particularly interesting. They talk about protecting privacy and civil liberties, okay? They should. Very important, okay? It's not all about security. It's also about human freedom and American civil liberties, American civil rights. The Bill of Rights, respecting the Constitution. But here's what's interesting. This is from the FBI itself. Quote, no one can be added to the terrorist watch list based on, listen carefully, race, I get it, ethnicity, fine, religion, fine, beliefs or activities protected by the First Amendment, or by guesses or hunches. Let me read something again. No one can be added to the watch list based upon beliefs or activities protected by the First Amendment. Do you know what I don't see on this list? That would be being added. Here's what I don't see on the list. No one can be added to the terrorist watch list based upon beliefs or activities protected by the Second Amendment. Notice that? They talk about the First Amendment, but they don't mention the Second Amendment. Why is that? I don't know. Inquiring minds would like to know. Isn't that quite interesting? I will mention this as following. If you go on and read some of the other articles in the Washington Times, other people being quoted, this is quite interesting. Representative Jim Jordan, you probably are familiar with him. You saw him on Fox News and everything else. Jim Jordan of Ohio, he's obviously a top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee right now. He says that several whistleblowers have already come forward with similar accusations about the FBI pressuring the underlings to try to find extremist cases. Here is what Congressman Jordan says, quote, I think it is what's ultimately driving his politics, Mr. Jordan said. If you own a gun, everyone watching probably owns a gun. If you displayed the flag and voted for Donald Trump, the president's going to call you an extremist, the president being Joe Biden. The president's going to call you an extremist, and it appears the FBI is going to use the numbers to satisfy that narrative the president laid out. So you have this political pressure apparently inside the FBI, inside the federal government, coming from above, coming from the President of the United States, presumably, forcing people to go out and find these things and label these things. So I could easily see people that have done nothing wrong being put on the terrorist watch list because, of course, they support the Second Amendment, they support guns, they support Donald Trump, what have you, Ron DeSantis, it doesn't matter. And we also know that story about a month or two ago where it turns out that showing Revolutionary War flags, the Gadsden flag, the Liberty Tree, the Betsy Ross flag, any sort of Revolutionary War symbols can be used as evidence that you are potentially a militia member or a militia violent extremist member, or whatever these concepts the federal government was coming up with. Remember that story? So I want to leave you with this. New Jersey is proposing that if you're on the terrorist watch list, then you can't buy a gun and you can't presumably carry a gun. And I should remind you, in determining whether or not you or I could be added to the terrorist watch list, I think, of course, that would be objectively absurd to think about things like that. But we don't. We live in crazy times, as best I can tell. So this is a quote from the Washington Times article. The Washington Times quoted a FBI agent, and this is what they said, quote, we are sort of the lapdogs as the actual agents doing these sorts of investigations, trying to find a crime to fit otherwise First Amendment protected activities. If they have a Gadsden flag, that's the don't tread on me flag, by the way. If they have a Gadsden flag and they own guns and they are meeting at school board meetings, that's probably a domestic terrorist. So again, we got to be very careful here in New Jersey because they're trying, and this is not new. The anti-gun movement has been trying to put anyone, because they control the government, right? They control a lot of these unelected bureaucrats, the unelected places. We saw what they did to Donald Trump with the Russian Gate thing. We saw these sorts of things. So it seems it would be very easy to add a bunch of conservatives and gun supporters onto the terrorist watch list, because remember, there's no check on it. They don't confirm you're on it, nothing like this. So there's no way to get off it. And again, none of it's objective though, because remember, the only way you get added to that list is someone forms an opinion that you're a terrorist. Someone forms an opinion that you're an extremist. Someone forms an opinion that you should be watched as a potential terrorist. So that opinion, of course, to me is naturally subjective. It's a subjective opinion, it has to be. And that violates NYSERDA versus Bruin. And never forget this. The Brett Kavanaugh concurrence in NYSERDA versus Bruin said that the New York's law, which was struck down as unconstitutional, and New Jersey cannot violate this, that if a law is, quote, constitutionally problematic because it grants open-ended discretion to licensing officials. Again, the reason why New York's law was struck down and why a New Jersey law would be struck down, including, I would argue, this terrorist notion, is because it grants open-ended discretion to licensing officials. Now, of course, the open-ended discretion we're talking about with the terrorist watch list is that someone else in the federal government actually exercised discretion in determining that you or someone you know is a terrorist and was added to the watch list. And remember, the key is it has to be objective. To determine who gets to carry a gun, it's objective criteria, it's narrow, it's definite. Having random people in the government put people on the terrorist watch list. Remember, there's no adjudication, there's no trial, there's no due process, there's no nothing. Someone says we should watch you as a potential terrorist, you're put on the list, and according to New Jersey, you would lose your Second Amendment rights, and you won't even know who did it, you won't know why you're on the list, you won't know what caused you to be on the list. None of the stuff will be available to you to fight and support your gun rights, and if you try to get that information from the FBI, I'm guessing what will happen is we can't tell you, because that would be confidential, that would be investigative privilege, we're not going to disclose it. So how would you ever get yourself off the terrorist watch list so you can regain your Second Amendment rights in the state of New Jersey or in any other state that adopted this kind of law? So again, to summarize, in New Jersey, they said that people are not allowed to be able to buy a gun and presumably to carry a gun if they are listed on the terrorist watch list maintained by the FBI. Given the fact that we live in a politicized world, there's a lot of political, not all of them, there's a lot of good law enforcement, and there's a lot of good people that work for the federal government, I completely agree, but it only takes one or two working against your interest to get you labeled a domestic terrorist, to get you labeled such that you get put on the terrorist watch list and you won't be able to fight it. There'll be no adjudication, there'll be no judge involved, you'll just get stuck on there, and presumably that would mean you wouldn't be able to have a gun in New Jersey, which seems to me to violate NYSERDA versus Bruin and the Second Amendment, among other things. Okay, hope you learned a little bit something about this proposal. I wanted to warn you people in New Jersey about this. And again, what they want to do in New Jersey, the anti-gun movement wants to do in New Jersey, trust me, they'll want to bring it across the country. So New Jersey is really an experiment in how they're going to go down the anti-gun road, and anything they're allowed to do, they will do there and try to bring it to the rest of the country. All right, I hope you learned something here today. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and we'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.